This presentation is part of a workshop voicing indigenous food sovereignty struggles, which has been organized by the project Indigenous Food Systems in Transition, financed by Future Food at the Swedish University for Agricultural Sciences. Furthermore, the workshop was organized in collaboration with Case Study 18 of the Horizon 2020 Finance project Just North. You are welcome to listen to the lecture.
I will start with Håkan Tunnon, who is from a Swedish Biodiversity Center, to talk on Pathfinders for the Future, Indigenous Rights and Traditional Knowledge in Sweden. Please, the screen is yours, Håkan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, welcome. Yes, Håkan Tunnon. I'm at the Swedish Biodiversity Center, and that's actually a unit at the Department of Urban and Rural Development, the same as most of the Swedes around here. And we've been working on issues regarding to biodiversity and societal issues. So how not the biological part, but rather the bits about how the society views biodiversity and how it's included into governance and things like that. So what I'm going to do today is to do something more theoretical than the other previous lectures. And I will present a paper that we published this autumn. And it's me and my co-authors from Jönköping University, Åsa Nilsson Dahlström, and Linköpings University, Johanna Dahlin. And my research perspectives have been working with traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, local communities and indigenous peoples, and often regarding conservation and governance of biodiversity and biological resources. So that's basically the starting point for my angle on this as well. So if I can have the next slide, please. So this is the paper that was published with the same title as this lecture, and it's available on sustainability and it is open access. And the idea when we started with this paper was that there's a lot of international discussions regarding the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities with traditional lifestyles in the governance of biodiversity and sustainability, future sustainability issues. So that's what we wanted to have a further look at. And so I go directly to next slide to actually come to something about the paper. So what we have discussed was, of course, that talking about indigenous peoples and local communities and the governance of land is often a more holistic way. So we do have the hardcore nature conservationists perspective, where we have indigenous-led conservation for the environment management. But this conservation issues and the governance part is also important for social, cultural, and political aspects of the life of the local people. So therefore, we had sort of this as a general perspective, and this is basically what's also presented in a lot of different international forums today. And we were talking about cultural revitalization as a way to actually increase the possibility for indigenous-led conservation. The next slide, please. And what we wanted to do was actually to see if the international discussion also had reached the Sami communities. And so we had a closer look at do the Sami people consider themselves in writing and in argument as stewards or custodians or pathfinders for future sustainability. That was sort of the starting point. And the research question will consequently be, do Sami organizations actually formulate these claims? And if so, how and why? So we could change to the next slide. And what we did was that we went to all sort of public documents, policy documents, public statements, opinion pieces, and things that's produced by two of the major actors on the Sami landscape, and that is the Sami Parliament, of course, and the Swedish Sami Association. So we had a lot of different texts written since 1992 and onwards until today to have a look at that. But we also had a look at different kind of statements in these texts, if they're actually claiming these things concerning custodianship, etc. And then we also had a look at the existing scholarly literature, because there's quite a lot of research going on a number of subjects that are connected to the land and the governing of natural resources. So there was mining, hunting rights, governance of the World Heritage, Laponia, of course, and also the things in connection with revitalization and decolonization. Next slide, please. And I will be very brief, reaching the results already. And yes, there is a repetitive use of these kind of arguments in these texts. And we can also see that there is an increase in arguments from 1992 and onwards today, and that's much more, and it's more clearer presented in the texts. And this rhetoric is actually based on both the Sami status as indigenous people, which is of course a relatively strong issue since we have both the legal and the political standpoint that Samis are considered to be indigenous people of Sweden and consequently have certain rights based on international agreements and so on. So this is an important part. But there's also things about mentioning the inherent sustainability of the Sami way of living, where there's claims of a stronger traditional ecological ethics, making them particularly suitable to govern these land areas. And that's interesting, and that goes well with the international discussions regarding indigenous people and conservation in today. And what we also could see is the increased inspiration from international processes and of course other indigenous peoples, where especially I think Australia and New Zealand progress when it comes to indigenous people's rights has played a very important role. And what we have been thinking about here is of course, why do they do that? And that is, of course, to convince people of their suitability to actually do have increased rights of land management. It's one statement. I can have a next slide, please. And we have, of course, a lot of international instruments that's been developed during these past decades. And of course, ILO 169 has not been implemented in Sweden or ratified, but it plays, of course, an important role in the inspiration of these kind of statements. And then it's also important, and that as being a part of these discussions internationally, I suspect that the results from the Rio meeting in 1992, where they stated the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, has been extremely important, both in Sweden as well as elsewhere, since this is sort of the first opportunity for indigenous people to actually take active part in the international negotiations concerning rights and conservation and governance of land. And I just would like to stress the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J and related provisions. That is one of these groups that have biannual meetings within the convention where they discuss and develop this. Right now we're in a middle sector where we don't really know what's going to happen, because we had a biodiversity program that reached to 2020, and then it should be a new one, but due to the pandemic there's not been that obvious where the future is going to lead. We also have the Aichi Target 18 that suggests the state should work on safeguarding traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use of natural resources. So these are some very important steps on the way. And of course, the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, which is not really about the governance, but it's strongly about the rights and those parts. So that plays a very important part. And then we also have the IPBES, Intergovernment Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That is a platform for discussions on how to prepare good documents to base the future political decisions on when it comes to biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable use and the future lives. And during 2018 and 2019, there's been several regional assessments as well as a global assessment on the status of biodiversity and ecosystem services and people's possibilities to have a good life. And in that context, it's been very clearly output that the indigenous people plays an immense role in safeguarding biodiversity in the world. And this, of course, makes us, this of course has influenced the way the Sami parliament and other Sami actors are argumenting for their cause. Could I have the last? It's not. Yes, it's all. Now, next slide, please. And we have been reasoning about why do they have. Normally, if you have a governing body like the Environmental Protection Agency, they have a right to govern. But in the Sami's case, you have to convince the other parties in the discussions that they are suitable. So in that ways, it could be seen that this issue about indigenous rights to govern their own land or their few traditional lands is not something that's self-evident. It's rather something that you have to convince them, and by positioning themselves as environmentally friendly and especially suitable for future work with this, that makes them a good ally for the state and the governmental agencies to actually increase their role in self-governance. So I think that's basically why there is a need for the Sami community to actually strong point these issues. I also want to stress that we have not looked at the validity of these claims in practice. So if we are not discussing if Samis are particularly environmentally friendly compared to others or something, we have just looked at the argumentation in these kind of documents. I think the next slide would be the last one. And that's a good end.